Well, my name is Nancy Schuldt, and I am the Water Projects Coordinator for the Fond du Lac Band of Lake Superior, Chippewa. And I've had this position now for almost exactly 23 years. I started in early September of 1997, came in to help the band set up a water quality standards and monitoring program. And it seemed so simple back then and straightforward, but what it has turned into has involved doing a lot more than just working on waters on the reservation, and has turned into a much broader, more regional kind of approach to protecting water resources. Well, it's certainly become important to me, even though I didn't know very much about it when I first started in this position. My husband and I are getting really excited about getting out and probably this weekend ricing for the first time in 2020. Um, I've come to appreciate it not only as a phenomenal food grain, but for me and my background in aquatic ecology, I've come to completely respect the role that it plays in really unique ecosystems up here in northeastern Minnesota, where it still remains, in many places, very sustainable and healthy, but there's a lot of places where it's not doing so well. And so a lot of my job in recent years has been trying to understand the threats to wild rice or to monoman, and to understand what we can do to help protect and preserve, and where we have to restore populations of wild rice. Well, it starts with our water quality standards. We are one of the 50 or so tribes nationwide that have federally approved water quality standards. And just like the state of Minnesota, we have a sulfate standard for the protection of waters where wild rice grows. That 10 parts per million standard came about from some intensive biological survey work done by a state biologist for the DNR back in the 1940s, and through just extensive observational data. Because it has become kind of a flashpoint about the regulatory approach and certain industries in this part of the state, there has been significant research done here in the last 10 to 12 years to first better understand its ecology, but to understand how the mechanisms are that excess sulfate loading to wild rice waters leads to a decline or outright extirpation of populations. And we've come to understand quite a bit more about how sulfate pollution affects wild rice, but it's also exceptionally sensitive to changes in its environment, like water level changes, whether there's been ditching and draining or damming, for instance, that changes water levels or changes hydrology in systems. It can wipe out wild rice, either seasonally or over time permanently. These changes in climate that we're already experiencing, things like a lesser period of ice cover can affect germination. Warmer weather can affect diseases and pests that are natural to the environment but are usually kept in check or somewhat more balanced. So it's just an exceptionally sensitive species. It's kind of our canary in a coal mine. We're involved in not only trying to protect but restore wild rice waters on the reservation that were subject to extensive ditching 100 years ago. And we're trying to manage water levels and competing vegetation so that our on-reservation wild rice lakes continue to be productive. We're also very involved in the restoration of wild rice down in the St. Louis River estuary. As the habitat is being improved, as the contaminated settlements are being remediated, part of what will indicate a healthier, restored St. Louis River estuary will be more wild rice. Wild rice was first encountered by the Ojibwe people as they migrated through the Great Lakes hundreds of years ago. They were driven by prophecies that led them to the place where they would find food that grows on the water. And one of those places where they found food on the water was down in the St. Louis River estuary. And so that figures very prominently in the Ojibwe history and their migration story. And they consider it a sacred gift from the Creator. It is a part of their cultural identity. They feel that if wild rice is lost, then they as a people are lost as well. And they also consider it to be an integral part of their family. They are in relation with the plants and the animals of this place, including and especially wild rice. Well, I can say that I have felt welcomed since my very first days on the job. And I have been working on wild rice and mercury in fish since my very first week on the job. And I continue to work on those issues because they really are some of the biggest and most intractable environmental challenges that we're facing right now. Protecting Monoman, restoring it where we can, and getting mercury out of fish so that we can eat the fish that we catch now that fish populations are becoming healthier too with the cleanup and habitat restoration. In Ojibwe culture, women are considered the keepers of the water, and I have taken that to heart. I've always felt drawn to the water. That's why I eventually went into graduate studies to better understand and to be able to take my interests and the skills that I was learning to a place where I could hopefully make a difference. But I've really come to appreciate the community that I work for. Some really exceptional people that work alongside me at Fond du Lac Resource Management, tribal leadership, but just the tribal community members, the elders, the families, have been so generous in sharing their perspectives, helping me to understand their community and feel like I can be a part of it too. So back in the mid-1800s, when the new American nation was pushing westward and looking for more resources, more timber, more metals, more areas to farm, the tribes who were living in this region were feeling those pressures. And ultimately, there were treaties that were struck between multiple bands or tribes of Ojibwe and the federal government. And these huge swaths of territory throughout the Great Lakes region. This is kind of a unique situation here in the upper Midwest, in the Great Lakes region. And I think it's because the Ojibwe people had some foresight. They realized that this area, this part of the world, provided everything you need for a very abundant life. You had plenty of clean water. You had plenty of food that could be gathered, harvested, fished, hunted. You had all of the materials you needed for shelter. It was a place of abundance. But only if you could move around with the seasons and be in the places where those resources could be harvested at the time that they were ready. Everything from the sugar bush in the spring to the fishing in the spring and the fall, the ricing at the end of the summer, the hunting grounds, etc. So when those treaties were struck, there were lands that were reserved. Those became the reservations. But for the rest of the lands that were as defined in these treaties, those lands were ceded to the federal government, but the tribes retained in perpetuity the right to hunt, fish, and gather, to be able to essentially make a living off of the abundant resources that these lands and waters offer. And those treaty rights that pertain to those ceded territories, for instance, the upper Arrowhead region of Minnesota is the 1854 ceded territory. Essentially, the whole U.S. side of the Lake Superior Basin is under these similar ceded territories designations. for the Fond du Lac Band and the Grand Portage and Boys Fort bands up here in northeastern Minnesota, in addition to the right to have autonomy within the reservations, the tribes retain the rights to hunt, fish, and gather on those larger tracts of land, at least where they are still public lands. And we have a lot of public lands up in this part of the state as well. Those treaty rights have been challenged numerous times and adjudicated and upheld all the way to the Supreme Court. They are constitutional law. They are the law of the land. And so the way the tribes look at the assertion of those treaty rights is to continuously remind our federal agencies, our federal partners, whenever they are taking an action, issuing a permit, spending money to do a project or supporting a project, we are constantly in consultation with federal agencies reminding them that regardless of what they are looking to do through that permit or through that action, that federal action, it is their federal trust responsibility to ensure that the tribes continue to have access to clean, healthy, viable resources. And that is our constant position and constant argument that gives us certain authorities off the reservation and a legal interest in the quality of the environment in those ceded territories. Well, those are two different things. It is still a valid and should be an enforceable water quality standard. It should be implemented through limits in permits that are issued. It should be implemented through water quality assessments when the state does water quality monitoring and finds a wild rice water where sulfate exceeds the standard. That should be a part of the state's impaired waters listing process. Those are some simple implementation actions that tribes in Minnesota have long been advocating that the Minnesota Pollution Control Agency take on. It is what they are required to do. It's their responsibilities under their Clean Water Act delegated authorities. And from what we've been able to see, they are not actually enforcing that standard, even in places where they know that permitted discharges, primarily from industry, are not meeting the downstream standards, and in places where they know wild rice grew or is still hanging on by a thread. So we're pretty disappointed at the lack of enforcement. We have continued to ask EPA in their oversight capacity to encourage MCEA to enforce this legal and implementable standard. But politics sometimes gets in the way of what an agency should be doing. For about the last 15 years or so, myself and tribal staff in other Minnesota tribal agencies have been coming to understand how water quality and water resources are being affected by the state's lack of enforcement on this particular standard. It is important to all of the tribes in Minnesota, and in fact the Dakota tribes down in southern Minnesota are dealing with trying to restore resources that were long ago destroyed by agriculture, by development. They used to have wild rice as well, and they no longer do. When we started to write comment letters and question environmental review processes and draft permits on the taconite industry in northeastern Minnesota, where we knew there were violations of the sulfate standard, where we knew wild rice waters that tribal members had harvested in generations past no longer could find rice, we started to see the industry pushing back. And when we asked the agency why there weren't permit limits or why these permits were so long expired, it seemed like we really turned over a rock. And Instead of seeing the issue once exposed be addressed, we saw a lot of pushback from industry. And in fact, it led towards our legislature originally trying to create a new water quality standard down in the Capitol, even though they absolutely do not have the authority to do so. And EPA pointed that out to them very clearly. So once they realized that they couldn't just legislate a sulfate standard, thereby absolving the mining industry from needing to meet it, they instructed the MPCA to tackle some new research and to revise that water quality standards, because they were absolutely convinced that if there was new scrutiny, new research, that 10 parts per million sulfate standard wouldn't hold up. It was old science. And so MPCA took on a 3-year program of research that was multi-pronged. It included field surveys, it included some hydroponics, very controlled laboratory tests, very short term, and it included some tank studies, little mesocosms or little experimental tanks where they could actually control the amount of sulfate. And over the course of several years, those multiple lines of evidence all supported maintaining that sulfate standard. And so as the MPCA tried to figure out how they were going to update their standard, but actually didn't have the scientific basis to revise it, they got immediate pushback from the legislators and from industry, and came back and did some more analysis, did some more massaging of the data, and essentially came up with some new proposed revised rules that were eminently more complicated. And ultimately, after a contested case hearing, an administrative law judge threw out their revised rule. And the PCA appealed that, and the chief administrative law judge upheld the earlier ruling. So that essentially meant that the proposed updated rule wouldn't stand. But there is an existing approved rule in place which should still be enforced. And we're not seeing evidence that it's being enforced, either in newer permits that should have clear limits, or in the state's identification of impaired waters that are not meeting that water quality standard. And of course, that all became a part of the controversy over the environmental review and the draft permits that were finally issued for the Polymet copper nickel mine. Well, that's really frustrating every time that I hear it, and we do hear it and see it in print quite a bit. It is not anti-mining or anti-industry or anti-development to continue to advocate for clean air, clean water, clean land, and healthy resources. Our engagement with the state and federal permitting agencies over these mining projects, both the existing ones and the proposed ones, has never been about trying to shut down those operations, to stop mining from happening. And you know, it's kind of strange, because that's one place where we might actually diverge a bit from some of the environmental groups who are using their voices and asserting their powers as citizens to argue against something that they don't believe is right for a place. What the tribe's position has always been, and clearly articulated in every letter that we write, every comment letter that we write, every time we're in a public forum, is that we are not opposed to economic development. It is our expectation that if a development or a project moves forward, that they would be required to meet all applicable state and federal rules. They need to play by the rules like the rest of us. And sadly, what we are seeing is that is not the case. Over and over again, we see this industry in particular, the mining industry, essentially being able to decide which of those air and water quality rules they're going to follow and which ones they simply are not. And they're going to drag it out through their own legal challenges and recalcitrance to installing pollution control equipment. And they're going to continue to try to maximize their profits by not investing in the environmental controls that they would be doing if in fact they were good corporate stewards, as they claim to be. It's been particularly irritating to hear from not only the industry and the legislators, but also the public, that we know how to do mining right in Minnesota. We should go ahead and move forward with some of these new projects or these expansions because we know how to do it right up here. And from all the evidence that I've seen over the past 15 years or more, we absolutely do not know how to protect our waters, our lands, and our air from this industry. It is an exceptionally intensive industry in terms of the impacts that it has on the environment. And they are not employing all of the most modern mining methods. They're using a lot of really old and inexpensive, relatively inexpensive mining methods, especially for controlling their waste. Well, I've certainly had a working relationship with MCEA for many years. Again, working on those same issues that I started working on with the band, protecting wild rice, trying to reduce mercury in fish. And so over the years, I've been at the table with MCEA representatives as we've looked at the statewide mercury TMDL and tried to bring about an implementation plan for all of the sectors, all of the mercury emitting sectors in the state to meet their reduction goals. I've been at the table with MCEA on the advisory group to the MPCA when they were going through that wild rice research and rule revision process, continually providing perspectives and advice and recommendations and guidance that would be protective of the resource. More recently, as we've come to understand and appreciate that the regulation of the mining industry is less than ideal or comprehensive, we have shared perspectives and strategies for not only raising issues when appropriate, like in the public comment period, but if those concerns and issues are not fully addressed, actually going the next step and engaging in litigation, actually challenging some of these bad decisions. And we have been a partner with MCEA in several instances. For instance, the U.S. Steel MNTAC NPDES permit. MCEA actually sued the PCA to get them to rewrite that permit that had expired back in 1992. And ultimately they did release a new draft permit, but as we saw then, it was still not nearly adequate. As some of the issues that are relevant to that permit, how polluted tailings basin seepage is exiting through groundwater but daylighting immediately outside the tailings basin in wild rice waters and leading to the decimation of that resource. That groundwater surface water connection was finally argued in front of the Supreme Court last year in a decision related to Maui for a similar situation where groundwater was actually polluting a surface water. And MCEA actually on the behalf of the Fond du Lac Band filed an amicus brief in support of a more genuine interpretation of what the Clean Water Act intended for something as obvious as that situation in Maui and the situation up at U.S. Steel MNTAC. And then similarly, challenging the wild rice rule revisions. I believe it was the very detailed and explicit comments to the administrative law judge that came from the tribes and from MCEA and other organizations, environmental organizations, that enabled an impartial justice system to see that what the state agency was doing was neither just nor was it in accordance with the state's own administrative procedures. And then finally now we find ourselves in litigation over multiple permits at PolyMet because it was such a fraught environmental review process. And I don't believe that at the end of the EIS that the environmental impacts, the likely and potential environmental impacts of that project were fully revealed to the public. And so the draft permits that were issued after that EIS process did not take into account the environmental impacts. And so we find ourselves in litigation alongside MCEA over a number of those permits. And I think this upcoming year we'll see what the fruits of those challenges might yield. It's kind of hard to distill it all down to one really single profound statement, but I would just say that we need to find our allies. We need to work with them because the pressure on our resources seems to be infinite, and their resiliency and their ability to rebound is not infinite. And for me, day to day, that's what I think about is how can we work with people who care about air and water and land and monomen and fish? How can we work together to help the public understand what is at stake and to push those organizations and agencies who have some authorities to do the right thing for us all? And I think that nexus between the band and MCEA is where we have found common ground.